This is Science 8, and we're getting ourselves to the final the final month of the education. And the way in which the structure of this education is set up, every 4 weeks makes a square where we look at a pair of texts together. And that pair of texts is like a tuning fork, and you can read as much or as little of those two texts as you like. The only proviso is that you read them together. And so the entire education has a methodology, like a calipers, which carried consistently all the way through, produces a continuity. This continuity is an energy wave. And we know from modern physics that an energy wave has a complementary function to a discrete set of elements. The most famous presentation of it in contemporary physics is that light is both a continuous wave and a series of photon particles. So that as soon as either realities begin to manifest, naturally and inevitably, it evokes the other side of that reality to come into play. In our education, by making a continuity wave of this methodology, of this process, the process then almost automatically engenders, invites, co-creates, if you like, makes happen in a mutually dependent way the positing of discrete particles, of discrete entities. And our whole education is based upon this kind of paired process. The pairing is to keep the process continuous and to allow for a remembering of the discrete elements that naturally come into play. By not concentrating on the discrete elements, by concentrating on the continuity wave, we allow for the discrete elements to gel out of the ambient environment, which means that they are gelled out of a totality. No matter how many possibilities there are, no matter how many variables there are, once something gels, it's made, it's manifested. It then has that existence. One of the difficulties of previous educational systems, a difficulty that dates back more than 300 years, a difficulty that allowed for the development of an actual schizophrenic mind. The modern Western mind is clinically schizophrenic because it's educated that way. Because we are all taught to pay attention to things and define them exactly, to delimit them with precision. And by making our attention here on the identities, on the things, we lose track completely of the context in which things can occur, in which they must occur, so that we end up with a mentality which is essentially a closed system, so that the minds, the lives, the preferences which we are surrounded by, which we ourselves exemplify, and everyone that we know, are examples of closed systems. Now you can come to something as recent as a book on quantum networks, Dynamics of Open Nanostructures, published in Berlin in English just this past year. And we read, towards the end of the whole argument of the book, on quantum dynamics, in the summary, closed systems are systems without coupling to their environment. And open systems are those influenced by their environment. They also use the term in here, which comes from Hellenistic Jewish alchemy. For environment, they call it a bath. That is to say, something which is related openly to its environment is literally bathed in that environment. The Hellenistic Jewish alchemical instrument that was made to exemplify that in the process of alchemy was called Ban Marie. Miriam the alchemist made this kind of instrument, a kind of a glass retort that allowed for a complete bath or immersion at a certain stage of the alchemical transformation to take place. And this was essential to the studying of transformation. At any rate, when we have minds and personalities which are closed systems, we are cut off from our environment, and literally, the more experience that we have in this kind of closed system, this closed personality, closed mind, closed life, the better we become at severing ourselves from relationality. So that there comes to be a crisis point of confidence, usually, in this kind of mind, this kind of personality, this kind of life career. The crisis is brought on by increased capability. There comes to be a threshold where one becomes so good at this that you begin to effectively to really do it, and one realizes that you're choking yourself off from everything else. Because increasingly, everything else is a part of an open system which you do not participate in. So this education is meant like an alchemical transformation to dissolve the certainties of a closed system and to return you back to the feel, the touch, the operative possibilities, the intellectual appreciation, the personal enjoyment of an open system. Now, in contemporary physics, one of the most studied of all ideas is the idea that Niels Bohr came up with. He was on a skiing trip in Norway in 1927, and he was skiing for about a month on this mountain resort in northern Norway, and he came to realize that some of the mathematical and physics difficulties that he was experiencing in his work, that he was experiencing highlighted by discussions with some of his students like Werner Heisenberg, that complementarity was a resolving idea. And so the idea of complementarity was born on the skiing trip. Later that year, in October of 1927, at Lake Como in northern Italy, there was a conference, a world conference of physicists, and there Bohr presented for the first time a paper on the idea of complementarity, making quantum mechanics a universal philosophy which soon began to be preferred to that of Einstein and relativity. And both those preferred to the classical physics meaning the physics of Sir Isaac Newton and so forth. Now we've looked at this, we've looked at this through our education from several different angles in several different ways. And if you were to place all of those different angles, all of those different ways together, if you were to montage them so that the central point, the synthesizing fulcrum of each of those perspectives was superimposed upon each other, you would actually have a focus that was complex rather than singular. It would be a focus where a complexity of layers, a complexity of planes of reference, a photo montage of many different perspectives brought together at the same time, you would then have a kind of space which is called a Riemann space. That is to say, a space that has not one plane and only one geometry for that plane, but you would have a complex multiple, so that space, location, focus all connotate, instead of one thing, they connotate a cloud of possibilities which simultaneously inhabit those defined locales, so that a locus or a focus or a point or a photon or an electron is not the name of a thing, but is a word that characterizes an immense complexity that has many different aspects simultaneously. This multiplication, this kind of multiplier effect influenced the world of the late 1920s to a fantastic extent. One finds it in economic theory. One finds John Maynard Keynes' general theory of employment, interest, and money being modified about that time by a man named Kahn, who developed the multiplier effect, where after that the whole marketing strategy of product was based upon not supply and demand so much, but creating the circumstances in a marketing program where the multiplier effect would take place, and one would have this trigger threshold after which the demand for a product would approach a feeding frenzy. And one could engineer this. One could make this happen. And a generation later, you would have books like Vance Packard, The Hidden Persuaders, where marketing now was not selling product, but was creating an environment of buyers who were hungry for whatever you offered them. In physics of the 1920s, in Bohr's experience skiing in Norway, his coming to the idea of complementarity occurred largely because he realized that we were bathed by an environment in our minds which was very particular, very peculiar. The environment that we are bathed in our minds for any idea is the environment of language. That we are literally afloat, suspended in an environment of language in our minds, so that all ideas, all conceptions have this kind of characteristic, that they are all open systems vis-a-vis language, so that language becomes a common denominator. The concerns of language, the characteristics of language become a common denominator to all ideas, no matter what they are, no matter who has them. And in order to determine, to choose, to select, to intelligently prefer one idea to another, one has to take not just the idea as a thing, as an identity form, but one has to take that idea and its relationship to language, so that you're dealing with idea A and its relationship to language, idea B and its relationship to language, and you compare not A and B, but the ratios. This idea vis-a-vis the language environment itself, to this idea in the language environment itself. This led to a tremendous concern then with a simple question: what then is language? And yet, that kind of simple question became a baffle, because the issue was precisely that language had been thought of as an idea in itself, had been isolated, had become something clearly identified in itself, and actually language was not at all an identifiable thing. And as the 1930s wore on, it became more and more apparent, not just to poets like a W.B. Yeats, but to physicists like a Niels Bohr, that language was a process and not at all an arrangement of things. Language is a flow and not whatever is suspended in that flow. Language is not words, but the flow of the usage of the words. And that if you keep looking at the words, if your attention looks at the words and the definitions of what those words are, you go literally cross-eyed in your mind, and you see the isolated things quite clearly, but you lose all sense of the context in which it actually occurs, and which is necessary for its rational, its ratioed meaning. So that at the very beginning of our education, just as we will do next month, I always come to this beginning quotation. This was written in 1970 and still functions. This education was in 1970 called the humanities program, because that's the kind of language that was used in the 1960s. And this was written in May of 1970. In this humanities program, the idea is to fill in the gaps and interrelational spaces that have naturally developed in the contemporary world as a residual of increasing specialization. This specialization has taken the predominant form of well-defined subjects and accurately delineated processes. The universal application of the scientific method to entities and logical analysis to procedure has benefited everyone by presenting reasonably clear pictures of the world. In this act of focusing, however, the background has been eliminated. The interconnecting tissue of the things and their movement has disappeared, not from reality, as is so ignorantly lamented, but merely from man's microscoped perspective. This humanities program restores the consciousness of this background and the requisites of human character commensurate with that restoration. So that we are always involved in a complementarity in this education. Basically, the complementarity is a syncopation, an alternation between process and objectivity. Both are essential. Both evoke each other. as in an energy wave, that when there's an energy wave in continuous process, it evokes in its own complementarity the particality, the discrete existence of things. Even in something as condensed and high-powered a logical statement as the beginning of the Gospel of St. John, one finds a transformation sequence. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was light, and the light was the life of men, is the perfect condensation of a double transformation. One begins by a language objectivity, which is a word, which transforms into a process of illumination, which is light, which then makes a transformed objectivity, life, which has a cosmological extent. The word is a singularity. The light is a transformational process, and life is an objectivity which is cosmological in scale. So that one has right there, in short form, 2,000 years ago, it was a very simple mnemonic way of understanding that you alternate process and objectivity, and if you want to have some kind of objective manifestation, you limit the flow of that set of alternation to one complete unit. Objectivity, process, objectivity. That set then gives you an open system definition that exceeds the delimitation of identity. You don't make a statement of objectivity on the basis of A equals A. That's very paltry. That's a stupid mentality. That's a closed system idiocy. It actually leads to a schizophrenic state of mind, to a fractured state of existence, to a personality that prefers disaster to love. So you have the beginning in an objectivity, the middle as a process, and the third element as an objectivity. If you wish to talk about a process, then you begin with a process, and the middle is an objectivity, and the third part is a process. So then having this tripartite, this trinity, this triangle, this triad, notice how universal this is. By having this kind of tripartite expression, one leaves behind the closed system limitations of identity. Identification, being confused with identity, is a semantic pitfall that has a very deleterious effect on the user and on those surrounding the user. The sociological form of it is very often the political statement, this group is expendable because they don't fit into our plans. You don't count because you're not like us. In order to circumvent and sidestep and move beyond all of these kinds of pitfalls, which in our century have just taken the lives of hundreds of millions of people, an education is necessary to restore both consciousness and character at the same time, that they occur at the same time, and that one of the most profound observations that one can experimentally make is that consciousness is never objective. It's always a process. Consciousness is not a thing, but an ongoingness, a continuity wave. So that it has in its reality, it has what we would call classically a dynamic. There's a dynamic to a process. The dynamic means that it is capable of going, of ongoing, of going somewhere, of achieving a direction, of accepting a vector. The reality of a process is that it can be given a direction. It can be given a vector. The forward momentum to the process of consciousness we call time. The complement to time is memory. Memory is the forward process put into its reverse. Notice that if you work with the nature of the process, it is ambidextrous. It can work forwards or backwards. And the backwards in this openness is not a regression. Whereas if you were in a closed system, working backwards from any kind of objectivity is always a regression. So that one has a fatal flaw in the kinds of education that we were given, that for the last several hundred years has been given almost everyone, is that we're prepared to have an addiction to the taste of regression as a way of confirming for us the identity which we need. Now, this is a built-in failure. It is a very chronic condition, and if one were a doctor of civilization, you would diagnose the patient as terminal, which, of course, is a diagnosis that's been reached from many different angles, all overlaying the same kind of juncture, which is the present moment, the present sociological moment, that it is filled with failure because there is no dynamic that leads to health which is possible whatsoever. Now, the good news is that all of this is an illusion. The acceptance of that end game scenario is only real as long as you remain in a closed system. By springing out, by parachuting out, by transforming away, by phasing forward or phasing in reverse, one leaves that closed system with all of its radioactivity, with all of its life-defying death certainty, and enters back into an open system again. The difficulty is that one's whole sense of security, one's whole sense of coordination, of ordination, is all calibrated on this old closed system failure. And one simply finds oneself in a freedom so vast that you don't know what to do because you don't know what there is to do, and you're no longer certain of how to even choose or how to even prefer, and it finally becomes absurd because you're not even sure who you are. And so one comes to the classic threshold. It's classic because it has happened countless millions of times. In fact, it happens every time someone becomes transformed back to an open system, to where the environment of reality now has a connection with you and you with it. The classic story is told of the powerfully meditating Buddha, the Siddhartha who becomes the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, under those 4 trees there in northern India, where he made a 7 days meditation under those 4 different trees, one of them the Bodhi tree. And finally, completing that lunar cycle of 28, that completion of that intense dissolving of all of the old closed system beliefs, all of the old security, confidential identities, came to a complete dead zero stop. And when 2 merchants came by and saw this meditating mendicant under the tree and hoped to get some good advice from him, it's good luck in business to talk to holy people like this, they offered him some food. And the meditating Buddha was stymied by the offering of the food from the traveling merchants. Because from his dead, even zero nirvana, he had no hands with which to accept their bowl. He had no digestive system with which to eat the food that was there in the bowl. And he was absolutely convinced that they were an illusion also. And that there was no one here to even think these thoughts. How absolutely, abstractly, sublimely ridiculous it all was. Nevertheless, he took the bowl of food and ate. And it surprised him that it still worked. But as he munched his rice with a little bit of cardamom, the flash of realization that came into play dwarfed his nirvana. He realized that there was another shore beyond absolute zero, and that reality has this magical, mysterious quality of happening all over again. It still goes on, and one still enjoys and still does, and it still has efficacy. How can that be? Because the absolute dead even zero was also a concept that was reached previously in a closed system estimation. And in fact, zero is never dead even, but is one of the most vibrant focuses in a Riemann space universe possible. That zero is protean in such a way that it functions mysteriously, magically, mathematically, and that one can logically and mathematically write 1 as 10 to the 0th power. Just like if you say 10 squared is 100, the squared is because of 2 zeros. Or 10 to the 3rd is 10 times 10 times 10 is 1,000 because it has 3 zeros. 10 itself is actually 10 to the 1st. 10 to the 0th also turns out to be 1 and not 0. Now, this is a very peculiar quality. And so 0, rather than being some kind of vanishing into nothingness, is a protean point out of which everything happens. And so one discovers, if you exercise logical systems a lot over years, over decades, over centuries, over millennia, you become used to the fact that in any logical operation you can substitute infinity for 0 and it functions perfectly. It doesn't change the validity, the soundness, the efficacy, the necessity, whatever criteria you want to list. Now, when you put that into language, when you say that everything and nothing are apparently interchangeable, one comes to a kind of a poetic Zen koan-like impasse. If everything and nothing are interchangeable, it means then that in the phase-form process, objectivity, process, objectivity, or process, objectivity, process, that in either of those processes, the center element can exchange with the other and function in each other's place as if they were existentially the same, except existentially they're transformed. Now, we started the education, and we'll start it again in another month, with this protean realization, which was reached about 5,000 years ago. It was news 5,000 years ago. The personage who reached that realization, that idea, that open system fulcrum 5,000 years ago was a Chinese man named Fu Xi. And Fu Xi was the dragon man. He was halfway between dragon and man. Usually portrayed with long hair, long fingernails, dressed in a leopard skin, and seated in a fierce-eyed concentration on a diagram that he drew in the sand with 3 fingers. And the diagram had 3 unbroken lines from the 3 fingers, and below it were 3 lines that were interrupted by a gap. The 3 lines that were unbroken symbolically expressed everything because it's a continuity. And the 3 broken lines expressed a gap, a hiatus, a discrete making pause, which was nothing. And it turns out that in the mathematical analysis, in the real analysis of such a pair of symbolic expressions, one has a binary language by combining the 2 of them together, which is able to describe anything as long as you keep the description refining itself. It becomes increasingly true all the time. This is known as a refinement by algorithm. An algorithm is a process that constantly refines itself. And if you have an infinite algorithm, it will refine itself infinitely. And one would like to then say, because one has the old bad habit, what about perfection? Is there not some last element that is there? Is it not an impossibility to keep refining all the time and never reaching? Now, Fu Xi didn't think of this particular logical conundrum. The man who thought of this was from a little town in classical Greece. The town was Elea, and the thinkers who were from that little town were called Eleatics, and the most famous of the Eleatic teachers was a man named Zeno. And Zeno came up with what has been known ever since he came up with it as Zeno's paradox. Zeno's paradox, the way he described it, he said Achilles was supposed to be mythically the fastest man who ever ran. But if Achilles runs a race where he stops halfway and then starts again, and then runs halfway, and then starts again, and runs half of that way, and starts again, if he follows this procedure, he will never finish the race. Because you can always cut whatever remaining distance there is in half. And though it becomes infinitesimally small, nevertheless it continues to exist into infinity. That the gap of existence continuing to exist in ever and ever smaller particles is guaranteed because it has a root in zero. That oneness comes out of zeroness. And that's what gives it its oneness and also gives it its approachability in infinity. So that the number of stages and phases between 0 and 1 is infinite. Nevertheless, both 0 and 1 do occur. And one of the mysteries that's involved in this is a mystery of mathematics. If you add up, if you sum the stages, instead of just counting the stages, if you sum them up, you get into a geometric progression. This geometric progression, as it increases, it becomes asymptotically related to infinity. If you move from 0 to 1 by discrete stages of 1/2, you will infinitely have 1/2s and never reach 1. And yet, if you take the 0 in its protean wholeness, it manifests 1 without leaving anything left over. This is what makes nature mysterious. But in order to have a something which one can see, which one can hear, which one could touch, in order to have existence, the one has to have a delineation of repetition. Or, on the other hand, equally, reciprocally true, one has to have a repetition of the 0. And so Fouché's diagram is not just a comparison of an unbroken and a broken line, a duality, but is a triad. And in that triad, in order to get to the 3 unbroken lines, one had a process of development to get there. And the process of development was that you had initially 1 unbroken line on the bottom of 2 broken lines. And this was one of the states. We talk physics for a moment. This is one of the states. This is where the unbroken continuity occupies a unique place paired with the 2 zeros. But that condition, that state, can also occur where the unbroken line is in the middle of the 2 broken lines. It can also occur in a third state at the top, where it's on top of the 2 broken lines. Now, if you sum up this line plus this line plus this line, in those 3 states, you come up with the trigram for 3 unbroken lines. So that the full way, the open system way to express the power of continuity of an unbroken line is minimal 4 states, the 3 states of its position in development, and the 4th, the culmination of the essence of those 3 states together. So that you have a set of 4 states, the 4th state being a sum of the first 3 abstracted in essence. You can do the same procedure in a complementarity fashion for the unbroken line, it has three positions. And it finally abstracted and summed, essentially has the trigram where there are three unbroken, or three broken lines. And so you have also a set of four for that. And it turns out that if you match, if you bring into pairedness those two sets of four, the middle of the exchange process does not happen in between the second and third trigrams, but happens at the second trigram. It happens in the middle of the process, so that where the unbroken line is in the middle, it can exchange with the broken line that's at the middle. That's where the transformation happens. It doesn't happen in the middle of the sets, it happens in the middle of the process of development. So that one learns a fundamental lesson about integration. That symbolic abstractions exist, but they do not participate in the cycles of transformation. They do have existence, but they do not count when you're looking for the center of a process of transformation. When you're looking for the phases that count, you have to take the abstraction out of contention. Yes, it's there, but it's there like you're carrying over numbers into another column. You just carry it over and you remember that it's there, but it doesn't participate in your calculation. So that essentially what you have as an operative working situation is you have a pair of triads, the middle term of which is able to exchange with each other, to function in each other's place, and still to affect existence, to affect process, so that objectivity and process happen just as if the original conditions were there, only now you have a transformed condition. This turns out, as we will see in another month, we'll start with that again, that this educational phenomenon is repeatable in human terms. One doesn't have to go back to some very powerful yogi like the historical Buddha. One could go, as we do go, the beginning of nature, we go to a New England craftsman who used to make pencils for a living. And he lived in Concord, Massachusetts. His name was Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau discovered one day, one winter's day, in a snowstorm, much like Niels Bohr skiing in Norway, and amidst all that snow, came up with the idea of complementarity. Thoreau was standing in a snowstorm in the forest, and he wrote in his journal, he said, "I joined the trees and became one of them. And when I became one of the forest trees in this snowstorm, the Henry David Thoreau became the entire world. That there was a reciprocality, there was a complementarity between the individual and the cosmos. And when you allow the cosmos to function at your center, your individuality infuses the entire universe with a smile." Let's take a break. Part of the process of this education, in addition to taking pairs of texts every 4 weeks, the consistency of method gives a process. The discrete element, the objectivity, is given by the monthly squares of consideration. But there needs to be a third level, as you can see with the philosophy of trigrams, or if you like, the theology of trinities, or if you like, the mathematics of triangles. It doesn't matter what kind of frame of reference you use or language that you would prefer. They all are simultaneous focuses of the same Riemann structure of the idea that a resolving third is necessary for a transformational occurrence. Because one has a process and an objectivity. You have a 0 and a 1, and you need to have some way in which to relate these two together, and that third is a resolving third. In a ratio, it's the line that's drawn to relate the numerator with the denominator. Or if you write it out linearly, it's the colon in between the two issues. If you're saying 3 to 4, you would write 3:4. Or if you say 3/4, it's 3/4 with the line. There's always a resolving third. And in the education, the resolving third is to take a single year-long experience. Now, we could, if we were in an ancient wisdom school, we would take our own experience for the year as our resolving third. Our interpenetrative experience with each other over the journey course of a year would be the resolving third. That's the way anciently it was done. But our education is a yoga of civilization, and it's not limited to the ancient model of self-realization. Self-realization is quite interesting up to the point of integral focus. But beyond that is another shore. As equal in extent as there is to the whole integral process. The differential realm is a complementarity to the integral realm. And there's a wholeness of that pair together. And so in order to emphasize the civilization aspect to it, we use the cream of all civilizations. We use books that exemplify the perfect highest qualities of all civilizations on the planet, because we would like to have a planetary culture. We would like to have a wholeness of the planet in its completeness as the context for what we're doing. But in order to have a planetary culture, it turns out that we have to have a star system-wide civilization. There's no way to objectify a planetary culture as long as you stay on a planet. You can't have a planetary culture with a planetary context. You have to have a larger context to allow for the form of a planetary culture to take place. You have to have a background that allows for that form to happen. And so as long as our experience is simply on one planet, we'll never have a planetary culture. You have to have a stellar civilization in order to have a planetary culture. Because then you see a planet in terms of the whole star system. And that's an environment that's realistic, realistic enough to allow for the form of a planet to come into exactness, into focus, so that one can then trust that what you're dealing with is objectively quite real. As long as our experience was limited to a single planet, there was no way we could understand it. It's like in a conversation, Carl Jung one time was being interviewed. And he realized that the interviewer was, even though he was a psychology professor at a university, was just a child, psychologically. And so Jung had backed off from a mature engagement with an equal and just became a kindly grandfather talking to a kid. He lit his pipe and was smoking away like a good hobbit. And the professor didn't get it. He didn't get that there had been a shift. He was still interviewing this guy. He wasn't even interviewing Jung vis-a-vis Jung, but it was a series on Freud, and he was interviewing Jung because Jung had known Freud. So he brought up the whole idea in psychology, the idea of a birth trauma. He said, Dr. Jung, what do you think about the birth trauma? And Jung took the pipe out of his mouth, and for a split second he was absolutely shocked. Then he recalibrated and he realized he's talking to a child. He said, well, we have no way of knowing. No one can talk about it because we don't know anyone who hasn't been born. It's not an objective consideration that we can take some context larger. He didn't want to go into past lives and things like that. There was no sense. There was no sense in talking about that kind of a thing with this kind of interviewer. The same thing for people. For people or any biologic life forms that are limited to a planet, they cannot conceive of their planet as a form. They cannot have a planetary culture. They have to go extraterrestrial. They have to go extraplanetary to have an idea. You have to go to whole star system. Then you know what a planet is for the first time, for the very first time. In fact, the very first human being who ever got it was not Yuri Gagarin, who stayed inside his little capsule, and it was not any of the fabulous 7 astronauts in their Mercury capsules. They stayed within the capsules which were still a part of the planet, still orbiting the planet. The capsules were not really in space. They were still part of the planet. It's like we've talked about in the education, that a difference between a history and a mythology is that in a mythology you live within the language forms. You're still part of a story. It's like in Lord of the Rings, Sam Gamgee says to Frodo, he says, I wonder what part of the story we're really in. I hope they write some good parts for us because I'm damn tired of having a tough time. Or a friend of mine who drew Zap comics in the 60s had a favorite phrase over his desk. It said, "Who drew you?" Think about it. He had another sign that was great. It was over the John. It said, "Don't worry, it is 100% out of your hands." In order to have a form, you have to have a context that allows that form to happen, to have objectivity. The same thing in our education. In order to have an objectivity of understanding what's involved in existence, we have to have a context that goes beyond existence. Otherwise, the objectivity loses reality. Doesn't have any traction, doesn't have any oomph. It isn't real. we saw that the context that is there for ritual comportment, which is the essence, the existential norm of objectivity, that the context for that is nature. For sure, nature happens. That nature exists is a nonsense question. Because only on the ritual level is there existence, and nature is there long before existence. Nature happens. So the best we could say, and we began with it, that nature is a mystery. It's not a mystery because we don't know, it's a mystery because we do know. That it's an ongoingness, it's a process, and that within that process, constellated are existences, and that we participate with both. We participate with the process of nature, and so are non-objective a great deal of the time. But we also participate with objectivity. We also participate with existence. We also do ritual comportment. And then we saw that you cannot stop with just nature and ritual, but all by itself, another process flames out of ritual. It's as if to make an objectivity, the compression of a process into its locus of objectivity has an explosive quality so that it bursts out again. And that nature, compressed into ritual, bursts out again into another process known as language, known as myth. That as soon as you do something with enough energy, that while processes have a dynamic, objectivities have energeia, energy. The ancient Greek preserves the pair. There's a dynamis and an energeia of any kind of an ecology. The dynamic is in the process, the energy's in the objectivity. And as soon as you have a ritual objectivity that's intense enough, like a human being is ritually objective, intense enough in nature, that language flames back into process. That one has to have enough intensity of that organic objectivity, and then language is there. The fire flames out of the wood, flames out of the stone, flames out of the ritual objectivity, and that's why all tribes dance. To focus that energy and to raise it so that words, so that language, so that myth flames out of one spontaneously. No one studies grammars and then first speaks. You don't see babies reading Noam Chomsky on transformational grammars before they utter a word. So that nature, ritual, and myth together make a set that's very stable. Very stable. Nature, existence, and experience are a very stable set. And the transformational node of that set is in the middle, is existence. So that existence is what transforms. And so you have to do a concentration. You have to get rid of the optical illusion that it's not nature that's transforming, it's not language that's transforming, it's ritual existence that transforms. It changes form. Nature doesn't have a form. Myth doesn't have a form. They are processes. They don't transform. They're ongoing processes. But what transforms are the forms of existence. They morph into something else, which is then equally existent. And that when one understands that entire triad of processes in an essence, in an abstraction, that's when you have a mind. That mind, the Greek word for mind was psyche. It means butterfly. It means the worm, the chrysalis, the butterfly, that whole set, that whole triad together is what the ecology of nature, existence, and experience are all about. And that the mind culminates that, and so it makes a set of four, just like the four trigrams. And that the transformation node is on the ritual level. It's what you do. It's what you do. That's the trigger for transformation. Doesn't matter what you think about it, no matter how powerful thoughts are. Their objectivity is of an essence of the entire set. Thought's objectivity takes in nature as well as existence, takes in experience as well as those two. So that a thought's objectivity is the entirety of the set, which includes itself. It can be powerful enough, focused enough to include itself, so that the entire extent, the largest extent that a thought can have, is that complete, perfected ecology of integration. That's what it does. And the way I used to talk 30 years ago, the ocean of nature laps its last wave on the farthest reaches of the mind. It reaches that far. Integration reaches that far. And that's as far as it goes. That there is a whole other ecology beyond that is a surprise. That whole other ecology doesn't take place in the mind. Its objectivity is not in the mind. It's in some radiative, joyful beyondness, which deserves respect and consideration. So that just as one learns a humility of the body, you have to learn a humility of the mind also. A lot of humbleness. Lots. More than one could believe, and even beyond that. But that out of that humbleness, that respect, that caring, that exploration, comes a whole complementarity, the differential conscious realm, its ecology, where it's interested in exploring, just as nature is interested in coming together, in having things be, and have that being feel and speak, and have that being and speaking come to a focus in realization. There's a whole ecology beyond realization, a whole other shore. And that as long as one is in the integral cycle, there's no use to speculate about the other realm, because one could only use an integral method of supposing which is inapplicable in the differential realm. But the same thing happens in the differential realm. One cannot forget nature. One cannot forget the body. They are not throwaways. One cannot forget experience and its reality. One cannot forget the mind and its objectivity. And they have to be remembered. And so just as there is a difficulty in going beyond the mind, there's a difficulty in reaching cosmic proportions because one tends to forget the whole integral cycle and its reality. And so one has to remember. One has to remember, that's right. This was true. This was actual. This is of me. This is still there. This is honorable. This is honorable. And that all of that brought together begins to have a second transformation. That what it transformed now again transforms, but unlike the kind of small sets where the transformation returns, process becomes objectivity and transforms back to process. It's a set. Or objectivity becomes process, transforms back to another objectivity, another set. This second transformation is a transformation of transformation. So that the very nature, the very form of transformation itself changes into something else. If you style it meta-transformation, you make a crucial error. You prejudge it and predispose it on the basis of what you knew, on the basis of your experience. The honest thing is to have, again, humility that you don't know and you'll do it anyway, to explore. You'll let transformation itself transform. And that turns out to be a huge surprise. It turns out that there's a consistency to reality that both Mother Nature and Father Consciousness both like to have a fertility that comes from an exchange of selves. They like to have children that come from the mutual exchange of centers of both orders. And that this is an incredible surprise. It's always a surprise. And that it is a surprise written with an infinity exponential. So that the surprise continues to be surprising all the time, increasingly so. And that this is the condition where the cosmos transforms into nature. And is again, yet for the first time, yet always, nature's mystery happening, ongoing, within which life forms can happen and take root and be. And have enough intensity of energy to flame into stories again and tell them. And so this wonderment of this great double process turns out to have a mathematical understanding. It turns out that when you have a pair of mutually dependent variables, you get a readout that's quite interesting. If you have a closed system, the variables in a closed system turn out to work in such a way that they self-select into reductivity. Doesn't matter how brilliant you are, how rich you are, how learned you are, how independent you are. All of that is irrelevant. The mathematical process is one of reduction, reductivity, of leading to dead end, leading to Box Canyon. It may take a little longer with brilliance or money or power or fame or beauty or whatever it is. But it's an inevitability. it leads reductively to a dead end. It's the only death there is that dead end. Thankfully, the phrase, man's extremity is God's opportunity, is true, and you get snapped out of that like some kind of brittle tiddlywink into some new kind of thing you never planned for. But what's interesting is that you can plan for, you can design for not a closed system, but an open system. And the best design for open systems are pairs of mutually dependent variables. Because in those circumstances, under those kinds of operative conditions, a sequence, I'm going to quote here from a mathematical text, with mutually dependent variables, a sequence of random variables constitutes what's called a Markov chain. It's a Russian mathematician who died in 1922, Markov, from Leningrad. A Markov chain. And generally speaking, two probabilities conditioned in different amounts of information, if they, in the early part of the sequence, have any element that's the same, they will remain not only mutually dependent, but that mutual dependence will increase the openness of the Markov chain. The variabilities lead into openness. Whereas if there is a singular focus, one runs up against the central limit theorem that the variables eventually tend to box one into whatever that particular limitation happens to be at its center. Out of this comes a very curious kind of strategy. It's a strategy of education, but it's also a strategy of life. If an intelligent organism chooses to live alone in what then is constituted as an enclosed system, there is a reductive factor that always enters into the process, and the more that you work that process, the more the reductivity comes into play. One would experience it as resistance. As resistance to what? As resistance to the kind of exploration that differential consciousness enjoys, exemplifies. It's as if one is trapped into an integral mode, and one can do anything that you'd like to do, except the only things that work are things that come together. Except that this is like a curse in disguise. It seems like a blessing at first, but it's actually the Midas touch. Everything you touch turns to gold, and King Midas, in his despair, embraced his children. They turned into gold. They're no longer children. So that Midas touch, that dependence upon integral only, turns out to be something where you end up reductively where you naturally would be, and that's at zero vanishing point. Integration never returns to one. It can go sub-one indefinitely. This is a neurotic stance. When you are operating on resonances that are not filling your existence, a sub-existential resonance produces a kind of a echoing cacophony, which is mathematically very much what a neurotic state is. And the more that that state is effective and operates, the closer it gets to a psychotic catatonic stop. Because the integration at that point is a reductiveness that goes back to the ritual base, which is 1. It doesn't go back to the natural base, which would be 0. It doesn't go back to Tao. It goes back only to Te, which becomes tyrannical, which says more and more to you in insistent terms, you've got to do this, you've got to do this. The compulsion to do something becomes tyrannical, and finally the only thing that really matters to you is that you keep doing. But notice this is a reductive ratcheting down to a desperate peril, perishing point. And all of that is needless. All of that. That entire scenario is needless. The suffering is real. It happens all the time. It happens billions of times a day. But it is not necessary. On scale of star system even, it's not necessary. On scale of cosmos, it's absolutely ridiculous to be caught in such ignorance. Because method of learning exists, can be utilized, can be followed. This not only happens in terms of individuals, it happens in terms of any kind of existential forms, including cultures or civilizations. We have used in this education again and again the example of Roman civilization to show what a dead end really looks like writ large, from Ireland to India, geographically, dead end. The central synthesizing vision of the Roman Empire is the Aeneid by Virgil. It was commissioned directly, personally, by Augustus Caesar. He said Greek civilization had its Homer, Roman civilization must have its epic poet, and commissioned Virgil to write it. And Virgil worked most of his life on the Aeneid. We used the Aeneid as one of the synthesizing texts in the second year of our education. In the first year of the education, we used Homer, the Odyssey. You had a choice between Homer's Odyssey and Melville's Moby Dick. Moby Dick was a masculine journey, and the Odyssey is a feminine journey. In the second year, we used Chaucer, the Canterbury Tales, as a feminine journey, and Virgil's Aeneid as a masculine journey. What happens with the Roman Empire is that it is based upon an epic that ends like this, and you can hear it. I don't have to say anything more. I'll just read you. This is a beautiful translation from the University of California Press, Alan Mandelbaum. This is how the great epic that was at the founding center pivot of Roman civilization ends. Aeneas stood ferocious in his armor. His eyes were restless, and he stayed his hand. And as he hesitated, Turnus's words began to move him more and more, until high on the Latin's shoulder he made out the luckless belt of Pallas, of the boy whom Turnus had defeated, wounded, stretched upon the battlefield, from whom he took this fatal sign to wear upon his back, this girdle glittering with familiar studs. And when his eyes drank in this plunder, this memorial of brutal grief, Aeneas, aflame with rage, his wrath was terrible, cried, "How can you, who wear the spoils of my dear comrade, now escape me? It is Pallas who strikes, who sacrifices you, who takes this payment from your shameless blood. relentless, he sinks his sword into the chest of Turnus. His limbs fell slack with chill, and with a moan, his life, resentful, fled to shades below. There are such things as psychotic civilizations. There's no need and no sense to follow in those kinds of tracks. They don't go anywhere. Whereas other than that little rut, any child can point in any direction and say, let's go out there and be right. More next week.